How are you? He's in here. He's lurking. I'm going to go ahead and ping the channel. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We're going to start right at 6 because we have a lot to cover. So I'm just going to wait a couple minutes. Move you guys over here. Cool. And then Aurel, you're muted. So if you are talking to me, I can't hear you. But if you're also just not wanting to talk right now, that's okay. All right, Matt is here. How's it going, Matt?
Going good. How's everybody else, or both of you?
Hanging in there, hoping we get at least a couple more people in here. Not that you guys aren't awesome, but we only had a...
I think we're worth at least 4 people.
Yeah. We had a couple people here last time. I guess people are taking a long weekend because of Father's Day stuff.
Oh.
Or at least that's the case for some people. How's it going, Abdul? He can't hear me yet, actually. And I would expect. I think it was just...
First time it's ever happened to me. I totally just absolutely blanked out on Thursday.
Yeah, I think you had said that you had your hands full that Thursday with the kiddos. So
that might have been the day.
Gotcha.
And my sister came over that night, and it was just kind of like 10 o'clock rolled around, and I was like, oh my gosh, I had a call today.
Gotcha. All right. And wait, John is here. Interesting. And Sergey's here. How's it going, Sergey? And how's it going, John?
Good. How are you?
Doing all right, thanks. John, you're joining us just cause? Welcome back. You're muted if you're talking.
I see. Just to see how things are going here.
Yeah, that's fine. We're working on the second part of our Sinatra build. So I don't know how Chris does his, if he follows something similar to Nancy. If he does, this might be super familiar, but we'll see. I'll take any input and questions.
No problem.
For right now, I'm going to dive right in for the sake of time. We're going to finish up this post app that we started on Tuesday. I'm not going to stop tonight until I'm actually finished all of the authentication and the login stuff. So if you have to drop off, that's fine, because I might go over time. I want to respect your time, so you can always leave as you need to and pick up where you left off in the recording. I won't be offended, but I am going to keep going until I'm finished. So as far as where we left off last time, so we're basically building this app that lets a user keep track of their posts, right? We actually kept that functionality pretty simple, but we do have a post controller that has some of the basic CRUD actions. We can look at all of our posts. We can make a new post. We can look at an individual post, and we can edit posts. I think that's where we left off. So we've got that post controller, and we've got most of our CRUD functionality. Today, our main focus is going to be on authentication, but first we're going to finish off the delete functionality, which we didn't get to last time. If you do have a question, please yell at me to stop. Otherwise, I'm kind of going to keep charging ahead because there's a lot that I do want to cover. So I guess first as a quick review, what controller action does this correspond to as far as our RESTful routes? What do we call this action? Or you could say, what do we call this route? But technically the route is just this part. Right. You guys have to know your RESTful routes. So this is the index action. It lets me see all of my posts, right? And what do we call this action here? As far as our RESTful routes. Some of us might need a refresher, or some of us aren't there yet, which is fair.
New action.
This is your new action, right? What do we call the action that handles that form to make a new post? Gotcha.
Sorry, do you mean by following the CRUD, like create or read or update?
So it's not specifically the CRUD action. These are both related to create, right? But they have different actions that they're referred to. So when we go through, we did this in our README here and also in our study group last week. I think it was last Tuesday. So if we think about these, right? So the C in CRUD is for create, and there are two routes that handle that. There's the route that renders my form. We call that the new action. And then there's the route that handles the submission of the form. That's called the create action. Got it. That's a good question. Where are we at? What do we call this action? It's part of our read functionality, but it also has a specific name in the context of our controller actions.
Is that show?
That's your show action. Good. What do we call this action?
Edit.
Edit.
This is your edit action. The get ones are easy because if you're being RESTful, the name of your view should match the name of that action. Hey, Chris. And then what do we call this action here that handles the form submission?
Update.
This is update. Perfect. Good. So just drilling you guys should have your RESTful routes memorized. For some of you like who haven't been to study groups, you might not have officially seen this yet because it kind of comes late in the Sinatra content. But you do want to have those really internalized. They're going to ask you that kind of thing in your assessment. So I just wanted to refresh on that first. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to add the very last action for delete, right? We know, right, for that delete action, we're making a delete request, right? And how should I structure the path for this route here? How do I know what to delete?
Post ID.
Yeah.
Right, so we're being RESTful and then we need to know which posts we're deleting, right? Then we start a do block, then we exit. And then how do I build this out here?
Post find by ID.
Good, right? Now, well, I guess I'll ask this question in a sec, but we can go ahead and we can find that post that we're trying to actually delete. So we need post find by ID. Find by is always better than find because it's not going to throw an exception if it's not found. And then how do I know which post I'm finding? How do I access that data?
Params. ID.
Good. You're going through your params. Perfect. Right. So then I'm going to go ahead and try to find that post. And then I can say something like, hey, if that post is found, if it returns a post, which is true.
Post. Yeah.
Yep. So if post, do one thing, otherwise do something else, right? That's a pattern that we're going to stress a lot. So if that post exists, right, we can simply go ahead and delete it. You could stop that there, but that's going to be a little disorienting to the user unless you also then do something else. I'm actually not going to use an else here because either way, whether I find the post or not, I'm going to go ahead and redirect the user. It probably makes most sense to take them back to their list of posts after they've deleted a post. So I'm going to redirect them to the show action. Right. why isn't this an instance variable? Deep sigh. They may ask you questions like this on your assessment. It is important. That's why I did it on purpose. I don't mean for it to be an instance variable.
Because we didn't print it.
Not related to print. So when do we need an instance variable in a controller action?
When we want to show
You
it.
gotta show it.
When you're rendering a view and you're using that variable inside of your view, right? So we're not rendering a view here, we're redirecting. So we wouldn't have access to an instance variable anyway. So we have to be rendering and then also using that variable in the view. So it's not necessary here, right? So now I have the ability to delete, but I need some way to trigger it, right? The user is not going to make a delete request directly in the browser URL. So the way that this is typically implemented is a special button that's actually a form, usually in your show page or in your index page or both. It really kind of it depends on how you want to build your application and what makes most sense in your case. I would say it's most common to implement it in the show view. So that's how I'm going to build it here. So I'm going to go to my show view in posts, and I'm going to implement here a form that when it's submitted is going to trigger that delete request. So we start with a simple form tag, right? And what does every form need?
Like a get request?
Well, not a get request, because a get request is just for displaying information. So I need to specify the kind of request I'm making via a method, and this will virtually always be post, because we talked about this last time. The browser doesn't really know how to send anything other than post requests and get requests without a little bit of help. So we will use rack method override to help make the right request. But as far as this aspect of our form, this is virtually always going to be post, right? We also need to specify where we're sending this request, right? What's the action? The most important thing is that this needs to match up with our actual controller action, right? So if we're making delete to post ID, our action for that form needs to be post ID, right? Does that bit make sense? It's kind of like a game of toss, right? We're tossing information from our form over to this route, so those addresses need to match. So we're gonna head here, and then I always feel like this looks really ugly, but we're in HTML land. If we wanna use Ruby to actually get that ID dynamically, we're gonna need ERB tags. So I'm gonna start a scripting tag because I need to actually grab the ID from the current post, right? I'm tracking the current post so far, but I need a way of saying, hey, give me the ID for that current post, right? And then I can say, we're going to make that request to post slash the ID of the current post, right? Does that bit make sense? It is a little ugly to look at. The pattern takes getting used to, but essentially we're just injecting that Ruby value into that string, right? So now I've got that, and then I'm gonna need something like a submit button, but I don't want it to say submit, I want it to say delete. So that's just gonna be a simple input. Now the type is going to be submit, and the default display is that it will say submit unless I give it a value of something else, right? So I want this to display as an actual delete button, otherwise it's not gonna make a bunch of sense to the user. So I'm gonna give it a value of delete, so it actually looks like a delete button, right? What else does this form need if I'm actually trying to make a delete request?
It needs the I'm sorry, I forgot what it's called. The like a dot delete dot clear or something.
Not clear. That's something that we might put in one of our controller actions, right? But basically we know that we're submitting this kind of officially as a post request, but we actually want to make a delete request, right? So one thing we already situated in the first half of our study group is in our config RU. We've got this middleware that we're using to basically give us some extra functionality that lets us make other request types successfully, because the browser's not good at handling other than get requests and post requests on its own. So we're basically using this middleman in rack method override. We use it most commonly when we're making patch and delete requests. We have it in our edit form already. I might just steal it from there and just tweak it. So we have this hidden input field. I'm actually going to copy paste it over. Oh, this is the wrong one, right? So basically we have this field that the user can't see because it's not really for them. It's for handling our request. It's always going to have a type of hidden and an ID of hidden. That's just rack method overrides rules, right? The most, I guess, two important things here. We're going to change this guy in a second. Basically, once we're requiring rack method override, it's kind of hanging out and lurking and paying attention whenever we make requests in the browser. What it's looking for is this guy here, right? When we're working with forms, what's the significance of the name attribute in your forms? Anybody remember?
This is your hash key.
Yeah, it's giving you your keys and your params hash. So anytime you're working with name in your inputs, you're going to get a key and params with this name that in simpler cases, so like in normal fields, like if you do name is, I don't know, title, you get a key of title, and then whatever the user typed in for the title, that's the value. But in this case, this key is what rack method override is looking for. And when it finds it, it's going to hijack that request and make the type that you specify here. So we actually want to make a delete request, right? So this is basically intercepting this form and helping it to make the right request type, right? So we're doing that for our patch and delete forms, right? And again, this is a form, but it's going to display as a button to the user because the user shouldn't feel like they're filling out a form to delete a post, right? Any questions about that bit so far? I think we're okay.
Is there any way to make it a link instead of a button?
I don't think so because, I mean, the short answer is maybe, but I'm not sure of a way. The longer answer is I mean, you might make it display as a link, maybe if you embedded this inside of an anchor tag, but I'm pretty darn sure we need this input tag for this to work. So if we can get it to work in that context, also with an anchor tag, maybe, but I haven't seen it implemented that way. We are going to do something sort of like that, but not for this request. Right now, we're going to have a little sort of routing for us because as this app stands currently, the user can't like edit their post or navigate to their list of posts without tapping into like the browser URL line. So the last thing I wanted to do is add a couple buttons here just for ease of navigation, right? Because when you guys log into like a Facebook or your Instagram, like you're not constantly editing your URL in the browser manually. You kind of just do it the first time you navigate to the site, and then you use something like buttons to take you through, or like a nav bar at the top. So we're just gonna make this a little more user-friendly. So in this case, what I'm actually gonna do is I'm gonna make two buttons, except I'm gonna spell it right, so that this displays as buttons to the user. And I'm gonna have two buttons, one that lets a user easily edit this post, assuming that it's theirs, and another that's going to take the user back to their post. So maybe something like view all my posts, right? And then what I'm gonna do in this case is embed these inside of an anchor tag, right? So they display as a button, but when the user clicks them, they're gonna navigate to that route. So I'm gonna add an anchor tag, and we know that those need an href value that takes them to some path. I'm gonna close that properly, and here too, and then do something similar down here, right? Now, as far as editing their posts, this is gonna look similar to what we did up here, I believe, because it's just gonna take them, almost, it's gonna take them over to their edit action. So we go from post to the post ID and then over to edit. I think I got that part right. So when this button is triggered, it should take them to their edit view. And then for this one, we just want to take them back to their posts, right? So I'm just putting in some really simple like navigation so they're not constantly manipulating the browser URL. And then I'm just going to get this running so that we make sure I didn't break anything. way things are currently. I'm going to try to remember I have this server running and this tab. You guys might have to remind me. So, okay, so this is just kind of my home page. It doesn't do anything crazy. When you're building your projects, I would encourage you, like this landing page, maybe have something like a nav bar or a few different buttons that the user can then click to take them wherever they want to go. But as this stands currently, things are kind of powered through this show action. This is going to look a little crazy for you guys who weren't in our last study group. We basically use the Faker gem to generate a bunch of seed posts. And I chose to use, they have like a lorem ipsum class that will generate dummy data in like Latin. So we did that in our seed file. So it's generating a bunch of fake stuff in Latin. So I don't have to manually type in all of these post names. So that probably looks a little crazy for those of you who weren't in that study group. But more importantly, I can see all my posts. And if I pick on one post, right, with all my good post words, I have a few different options. One, I did something wrong because I'm seeing these tags here, but I can navigate to.
It's closing tag.
I see.
Closing tag on that.
So that's in my show.
Yeah, look at it's
Gotcha.
not a closing tag, it's an opening tag. The A tag, the end.
Got it. I got that here. So that was the one guy, and then some guy here inexplicably.
Yeah.
And then also this is a closing tag, so it doesn't need an href. Cool. Thank you. So that part looks a little bit better now. I must also have that routing wrong based on how this URL looks. But I can go. Let's try that again. Okay, that looks a little bit better. I can click on the button that should see. I've got this post in here twice for some reason. So that's here. When I go to edit, it's going to post/post ID edit, and that part seems right. And then if I go, let me get rid of this for a second. Href, that's taking me here. I click my edit button. I've got a button. I've got a button. That looks good. At post here, at post ID/edit. To me, this looks right. You guys see anything I don't see? Because that's breaking when I click it. At post, that's the right kind of tag. Oh, that'll do it. That leading slash. Okay, so now we're here. I'm gonna refresh this just to be safe. Now, if I click edit, okay, that takes me to my form to edit the post. I can try editing it. I can submit that. And it's I chose to make this redirect to the original post that's been edited, like the show page. So that's been edited. I could delete that post if I want, except it didn't like that at all. Bad request. Post. I forgot the slash here too. Good job on me. Right. So let's try that again. Not that guy. So if I hit delete, I think I have to refresh it. Now it's trying to get the 10. So we have the delete. We got our posts here, action/posts. That guy looks good.
The percentage, huh?
Yeah, I see. I think Chris called that for me in the last study group. Thanks, John. So try, third time is a charm, right? So we refresh. Now we're gonna try to delete. I think I have a prize somewhere, or actually it just took a second. So now it's taking me to all my posts, but that post isn't here anymore. I've only got the one post that's in generic English. And then what else do we have as far as our navigation? I can just go back to my index action or my index route pretty easily, right? Any questions about that bit so far?
I have a question. How did you know to use anchor tag there?
So it depended on my goal. I want essentially a link, right? Because the action of clicking on the link is going to make this request for me. What I want is a nice user experience. I don't want the user to have to keep track of the ID of their post because that's not something the user should be concerned with, right? So I'm taking that job away from the user, right? Because I'm in control of where this request is going to go when this link is clicked, right? So an anchor tag is essentially just giving me a link that controls my routing when the user clicks this. The actual button part is just for display and how it looks to the user. If I didn't have it as a button, it would just kind of look like this here, right? Because that's what how the anchor tags like basic styling looks like. Whereas when I have these embedded in a button, it looks like a button, right? So a lot of this is about the user experience. It shouldn't be work for them to figure out how to use your application.
Got it. And then how did, can you just show me the part in the code again? Like if you had put like the delete part, for instance, like how did the program know to delete it? Like, let's say you'd put banana or something, you know, but how did it know to wipe it?
Okay, so there's two parts to that. How does it know the request type to make? That's handled here with some help for rack method override. As far as how the request is handled once the form is submitted, that's in my actual controller, in my routing, right? I'm saying, hey, when we make a delete request to post/ID, right, find that post. If you do, delete it and take them back to all their posts.
And what about edit this post? Like, how did it know to like go into the mode of like actually editing?
Okay, so again, that's two parts.
Okay.
I have my form. Because it's a patch request, I have to use rack method override. So that's how I'm specifying how to make that request. But it's the same principle. Once the request is made, it's going to be routed in my controller. So we're going to look for a patch request to /post ID. If we match that, we're going to find the post. We're going to try to update it and kind of act accordingly. Okay, you're welcome. Now,
I hate to bother you. A quick question. Is there, this is more of a design question. Is there any rules or common practices for how to present deleting and updating information? You know, because if you delete it like this, yeah, that's great. We know we deleted it. But to the average user, they might be looking at where did it go? Did it really get deleted? You know, does that make sense?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So there's a couple ways you can implement this. You can use flash messages. So then you can immediately display on the page that you're redirecting them to, hey, post successfully deleted, something of that nature. That's probably the most common use case. You wouldn't have something like an error message to work off of. So off the top of my head, you can use something like, I think it's called Sinatra Flash, although there might also be a rack flash. There are gems that basically let you make use of flash messages that you could then display on the view to give the user some feedback on what just happened.
Okay.
Okay, so that's something, yeah, that's something we might touch on more either in Thursday or another office hours because it's relevant. It's not required, but it's nice to implement in your project if you can. Okay, so now I have full routing. I'm gonna do a quick commit because I was trying to like build that pattern into the last study group. So I might do something like git add. I'm just gonna stash all my files and say git commit, and then something like adds delete functionality and edit index buttons in show page, something of that nature. Short and sweet, but it's descriptive. I'm not gonna push just yet. Any CRUD questions before we move on to authentication? Because that's kind of like the main topic for today. No, okay, cool. So basically we've got this user model that we haven't done much of anything with. We do have a user, it has many posts. We have some data for it in our database. So a user has a name and an email, but we haven't done anything related to passwords or logging the user in and out, right? So what I want to be able to do is persist information about our user across different requests. I want to keep track of who's logged into my application. So I'm going to choose to implement the login and log out first because I think it's less straightforward. We're gonna do sign up last, which is a little bit backwards, but that's presented pretty clearly in the lessons. And I'm trying to do some things first that are either not presented well or at all. So I'm trying to get that stuff out of the way first. How do we keep track of our users across request types? Those of you guys who have seen this, what mechanism do we have for keeping track of our users and whether they're logged in?
Sessions?
Sessions, right? So because HTTP is stateless, right? By default, from one request type to another, we don't have a way of keeping track of the user's information, right? So one mechanism we use to keep track of state across request types is to use the sessions hash. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to enable our sessions. The way to do this is in this configure block in your application controller. You're going to do the following two things. You are going to enable sessions first. Sorry, you guys might see me. So it's like I don't have air conditioning and it's terrible here. Bear with me. So we're going to enable sessions first. And then we can set something called a session secret, which essentially is a unique identifier for your application. I wanted to do this first because the lesson presents a way of doing it that's not secure, and they tell you that, but they don't really steer you in a good direction of like how to not do it that way. They kind of link you to blog posts and things that are not super clear. So the way we're going to start doing this is with a simple string. This could be anything that you want. You could call it crazy fun secret. You could call it 1, 2, 3, 4. But in any case, this is pretty insecure for a couple of different reasons that we're going to talk about, and we're going to look at a better way of doing it. What I want to show you first is that it does just work out of the box like this. I can set a session secret to whatever string I want manually, and that should work just fine. I'm going to go ahead and put a binding in my post action just so we can see that. And then I've still got my server running. So if I try to look at all my posts, we should see it's hanging because I'm in Pry. And just, oh, wrong one, we're here. And if I type in session, right, I get this funky looking hash, right? It's keeping track of my session ID. It's got a bunch of other data that I frankly don't know too much about as far as what's happening under the hood there, but we have successfully enabled sessions. So we have that to use if we want to, but this is pretty insecure for two different reasons. I guess insecure is a weird word to use. Not secure is a better word to use, right? Why isn't this terribly secure? Anybody know?
It's just strings.
Right, it's just a string and it's something that could be relatively easily guessed. So it's not the string aspect, it's that it's something that in theory could be guessed, or even right now, this is actually one I wanted to push. Let me show you guys. This is my, oh, this is fine, this is just my server. So let's say git sessions. If I push this code, and I go to my repo, so my controllers live in app, I go to my controllers, right? That's right there for anyone to get, right? It's been hosted right directly on my public repo. So not only is it not a very secure password, but I'm basically saying, hey, come here and get it, right? So that's another reason that this isn't very secure. So I'm going to show you one way of handling this better. It's not the only way of doing it, and there are a few different variations on doing it this way, but I wanted to show you one clear way that's in line with some of the resources that I'm going to share with you. Because I don't want to show you one way and then the support articles like do it a different way. So first step is that we're going to generate a more secure secret. I'm going to share some resources related to how to do that. Probably the most common use case is to use a Ruby library called Secure Random Hex. Now, I'm going to link this to, this is actually raised on one of our lessons that was like, you never showed us how to do this a safe way. You just tell us that we should. I'm going to run this line here that all it really does is it's going to require that library. And it's going to basically generate that, it's just like a string of various characters, right? Random hexadecimal strings. So it's basically a one-liner that I can run that's just going to output something that's more secure, right? So I could do that here, and it's just going to output kind of this random output of numbers, and it looks like just digits, right? Which would be relatively hard to guess, right? If I didn't want to do it that way, because that's a little obscure, I'll share that command with you so that you have it. But I'll also show you, oh, not this way. I'll show another way of doing it once I find the chat. I always struggle with this part. Some of you are chatting with me, I see. That's where it looks. Gotcha. Wetlands. Deleting records if you deleted the parents. Interesting. You might come back to some of your comments, John. Thank you. I didn't see those till just now. I'm just going to enter the command here. What you could have also done, I think I was poking around with a couple ways of doing this. So one thing that I did, if you didn't want to do it that way, if you wanted to just kind of run to a console and generate it, in my, not my gem file, because it's not a gem. I think it's in my config.ru or my environment. Okay, so in config, in my environment file, an alternative way of doing it is if you wanted to, I think you just require secure random hex, require secure random, I think it's called secure random is the name of the library. And then if you had it required, what you could do alternatively is if you run a rake console, I have this in my rake file. What you could then do, I'm pretty sure, is you can do, I'm actually forgetting that command now, secure random.hex, right? And it's essentially doing the same thing. So I gave you two alternatives just for the part where you're actually generating the secret, right? So two ways of doing that piece. And then what you could do that's at least a little bit better than what we did before is we then just use that secret, right? So that's at least a more secure secret, but there's nothing that's preventing me from pushing that on GitHub for anyone to just grab and get, right? Are there any questions about generating this so far? I've given you two different ways. I'll also link articles and things that will give you some resources too.
Oh, yes. Is this comparable to when we were trying to hide the API key for the API?
You're reading my mind. So for those of you who did your CLIs with an API and needed an API key, what I'm going to do next is going to look really familiar. We're basically going to use environment variables to help us hide this value so that it never gets pushed to GitHub. Again, there are different ways to do this. I'm going to show you one way. We're going to use the .env gem to do this. This is commonly done. We'll also look at this more formally in mod 3. But essentially, this is a gem that is going to give us access to environment variables in a particular way. And then we'll talk about how to then hide those from GitHub. So the very first thing that we're going to do is we're going to install this gem. I think I already put it in my gem file, or you know what? I was working on a copy, so I don't have it here. So I'm going to add this gem. It's always weird to talk about because it's dot, like literally dot, not like a period, but it's called .env. So I'm going to add that into my gem file.
I have a quick question before you go.
Sure.
I've noticed that your gems they're stacking up. Like there's a lot of gems. Is that going to affect the speed of the app, having too many gems?
The short answer is maybe. I don't think it should matter too much. Sinatra is relatively lightweight. Rails is a bigger gem. I would say on the grand scale, it's probably not going to make that much of a difference, but I honestly am not sure.
So utilizing many gems to get what you need is not going to be a huge deal unless it starts to become ridiculous.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I haven't, the only gem I found is an issue is Nokogiri, which is in everything and takes forever whenever you're bundle installing. But I can't say that there is anything else that I've run into like a big performance issue.
It probably has a lot to do with what you're trying to do with the program, the app. You know, if you're crunching big numbers, or you're asking the app to do a bunch of number crunching, it's going to slow it down. I'm sure you're familiar with Python. It crunches numbers really well, but it slows down. Same thing with this. I mean, the more you tax the server, the more it's going to slow down. I'm sure usage is going to slow it down as well.
Fair enough. Okay, so probably less gem specific and more what your app is doing is what I'm hearing. Cool. Does that help a little bit, Josh?
Most definitely, yes.
Okay, cool. All right, so we've got this gem. I'm going to run a bundle install. I don't think I should need to install this manually. I think I should be good. So we're doing a bundle install. We've got our .env in our gem file. What we're going to do, just for the particular way we're going to access this variable, I'm going to link to a blog post that goes through this. This was actually written by a Flatiron student as she was learning how to do this for her project. But what we're going to do in, I believe it's not our, I always forget config versus config.ru. It's in our environment file, which is in our config.ru. We're going to add the following 2 lines. We're going to require that gem here. And then we're going to add the line .env.load. .env.load, that looks good. That's going to load that for us. So that's kind of the first piece as far as requiring the gem. What we're going to need to do then is create a special type of file that's going to hold our environment variables. The main thing is that this file needs to be in the root of your application or it's not going to do anything. So it cannot be nested in any other folders. What I'm going to do, because VS Code hates me when I try to make files in the root directory, I'm going to do it manually here. So I'm going to use the touch command to create a file called .env, right? And this is where I'm actually going to store my session secret. So that file lives here. And this is where it should start to look familiar, Sandy. In this file, the general pattern is that we're going to create some kind of a global constant. So some capitalized variable that then points to whatever thing that we're trying to store securely. So I'm going to call this secret, but there's nothing special about that term. It just needs to be a constant, right? I could call it my app secret. I could call it banana. It doesn't matter, but it's going to be capitalized. And then its value should point to that value that I'm trying to store. So that's coming from our application controller. I'm going to grab this value here. You don't actually have to store it as a string in your .environment file. I'm pretty sure it works either way, but it's more typically done this way. So now I'm storing that here, right? And the way I would then access that, one way I would do it. It's more commonly done this way, where you reference env for your environment variables, and then you use a bracket and reference the name of that key that you set up in env. That's the way that this is more commonly done and the way that you'd likely see it in mod 3 and onward. So you would do something like session. Right. I'm not going to do it that way here because the docs that I'm sharing with you don't do it that way. So that's confusing. The way that we're going to do it following their pattern is we're going to use env.fetch, right? And then we pass it an argument of the name of that key. So we're calling that session, right? So it's basically another syntax. There's not too many differences. I think one, like if that key's not there, one throws an error and the other returns nil. It's not a major difference. I do know if you're going to use this syntax, that's what this line is enabling. If you were going to do it the other way, I'm pretty sure you don't need this line. But this is a way that will work. So then now this looks a little bit better, but I still haven't actually done anything to prevent this from being pushed to my GitHub. Sandy, do you remember how we did that in your CLI project? Not to put you on blast, but just a little bit.
Do you mean the part where it's like we don't want people to like hack it?
Well, we don't want it to be pushed to our GitHub.
Did we have to go to the GitHub repository or something?
Not quite. It's okay. It's okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to add another file here called a gitignore file. Right? That also is going to be in the root directory of my project. So I'm going to just use touch to generate it. It's literally called .getignore. And its whole job is anything that you list in this file, any files that you reference here, they're not going to be tracked. Well, I guess this part I'm not sure of, but I know they won't be pushed to Git. What I'm not sure of is if they're tracked by Git at all. But I know it's going to prevent them from being pushed to GitHub. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to list that file that contains my sensitive information. It's called .env, right? I don't want that file pushed to GitHub because that's what's actually storing my session secret, right? So that way, like the actual session secret is never referenced directly here in a way that can be easily visible to anyone, right? So now if I go ahead and I stage and commit.
You only called it session instead of secret.
Oh, thank you. What would I do without you guys? I mean one thing, but then I do another thing. Thank you. So I got to do that again. Right. So I've added it. I'm committing. Something of that nature. Right. So now if I go ahead and push, right. First thing, any secure, like any sensitive information that's been pushed, like even if you remove it, you should probably generate a new secret, right? That one's been compromised. Thanks for the link, John. Got it. I lost my train of thought. We're going over to this guy here. So now if we refresh, right, that's not here. I mean, we have our reference to it, but if I look at my general app structure, I shouldn't see that .env file anywhere, right? So it's been hidden, right? So this is a
Gitignore is still going to be there.
I mean, the gitignore is fine because it doesn't do anything except reference that file by name. So it just says there's a file with that name somewhere, but the file itself has not been pushed to GitHub. Right? So there's no way that someone can remotely like access this from my GitHub.
Wait, so anyone wanting to use the application would have to download the version and then create their own env file with their own session key to be able to use it?
That I'm less sure about when we're talking about actually cloning down an application and using it, as far as like hosting it. So that I'm not 100% sure of. Okay. Right?
Now what happens if it's put into the host? Where would that file go once it's being hosted so that it can create keys for people?
That I don't know off the top of my head. If we're thinking about hosting things, that's something we can talk about later. I'm not sure offhand how to implement it. I don't know. I feel like if I had to bet, John has hosted his app, so maybe he would know if he's done something like this. But I don't know, and I want to move forward if that's okay, just for the sake of time, because we're already behind where I want it to be. I just wanted to show you a way because it feels like the curriculum says do it some other way, but then they never show you how to. Whereas it is best practice to store that kind of information in environment variables. I just don't know how it factors into like hosting, to be frank. I do know a big disclaimer. If you're working on your project in the IDE, this is something some students had to do last time. Like if you're working on your project in your IDE, the way that you work on it is you clone it down every single time from your GitHub. So if you were working on it in that fashion, every single time you'd clone it down, you'd need to make that .env file again and add in that session secret. So what I've had students in the past is like have a sticky note on their machine where they're actually storing the actual value so that they can remember what it is and they don't have to keep regenerating it. It's not as big of a deal if you're working on it in your local because you have it saved locally. It's just not on GitHub. Right? Any last minute questions about that piece?
It wasn't a big deal in the review, so.
Sorry?
It wasn't a big deal because I had the secrets just stored in the controller, and it wasn't a big deal.
Okay, so you just, yeah, they're not going to ask you about it in your review. If anything, they're going to be impressed that you at least took a step to make it more secure. They're not going to make a big deal about it. That's not something they generally touch on. It's just something that some of you have asked me about, and I had to like go out and figure out a way to do it, because when I did my project, I just had it as session secret, right? Because I didn't know any better. So I just wanted to show you guys another way of doing that. Cool. All right, so we've got our sessions. We didn't push that file. That's where we are now. So what's the punchline? Now we have a more secure session secret, but it's still gonna work the same way as far as giving us access to the session. So if I go back to my site and try to look at my posts again, I think I know what that is. I don't feel like I should have to do that again, but, or you know what? I was working in a copy of this app earlier. I think that's what it is. Try one more time. Now we're, oh, am I going to log in? I should be going to posts. It still doesn't like it in my config RU.
Did we bundle install?
We did bundle install. Config. It specifically doesn't like config RU. Operations. It shouldn't be anything related to here. Cannot load such file .env. And I have that here. Require.env here. I've got that in my gem file. I've got that here by the same name. We did do a bundle. Install. We're going to stop our server and try again. If not, we can go back to doing it the other way. I had tried this like a dozen times today, but we'll see. Okay, it's hanging. So I think I just needed to restart the server. So we're here. So we can look at our session hash. It still exists. We just generated it in a more secure way. I wanted to show you guys that piece. But the punchline is we get the same functionality. It's just more secure. Now, what do I want to do with this hash? Right? This is where I want to set current information about like the current user who's logged in right now, right? So before we get to that piece, thinking of our model, what gives me the ability to keep track of user passwords in a secure way? For those of you who have seen this so far.
It's a bcrypt.
Yeah, so you have the bcrypt gem that does a few different things for you, right? It gives you the ability to handle, or so to have what we call a salted and hashed password. Essentially, hashing is just the act of like jumbling up your password. And salting is where you're generating kind of a random string that you're first adding to your password, and then you can jumble it, right? And the combination of these two things makes it very, very difficult for someone to, like, let's say your database should be compromised. They're going to have a heck of a time trying to work backwards and generate original passwords from that. I'll also share some other links related to salting and hashing. But suffice it for us to say is that we're adding some random characters and then jumbling up your passwords, and they get stored that way. We never ever store plain passwords in our databases, right? That's not secure. And we really, even like as programmers, we should never have direct access to our users' passwords, right? Because the user of your application shouldn't have to wonder if the employees of that organization are trustworthy in the first place, right? So it's taking that away from us. So that comes out of the box with Corneal. So you'd have that gem. And then there's one other piece that I need in my model here for user that works along with bcrypt. What do I need in my model?
Belongs to.
Not belongs to, because that's for my associations, right? A user actually doesn't belong to anything in the context of this app. But there's a specific macro that I need.
Is it has secure password?
Yes, right? So you have this macro called has secure password that it's provided by Active Record, but it works in conjunction with bcrypt, and it does a few different things. It provides us with some specific methods. So like bcrypt lets us store our passwords securely by hashing and salting them and storing them in the database that way. And then has secure password gives us a couple of methods that let us handle sort of logging in, like we're validating their password if you want to think of it that way, right? But it works along with bcrypt. Another thing that it does is it prevents a user from ever being saved if they haven't provided a password. And that's something I'll also link to. I think that is linked in the lesson, some things related to has secure password. But you should be able to articulate in an assessment that bcrypt is letting you store passwords securely, and that it's also working with this has secure password method or macro that gives us access to some other methods. Right? So I have that macro added. What do I need in my table for users that I don't have currently?
Password?
Do I want to call it password? I want to keep track of passwords, but there's a special column name that we use here when we're working with our passwords, when we use bcrypt.
Is it password digest?
Password digest. It's literally your digested password, the scrambled up version. So when we're working with bcrypt, we need to call this column password digest. This should not be called password. So I'm going to write a migration that's just going to add that column. Rather than roll back and tweak this, I'm going to generate a new migration. I'm going to go here. So I'm going to use a generator. So grapedb, we're going to create a migration. Now here, this is a migration that's not going to create a table. It's going to add a column name. So we're going to call this add password. We could call it add password digest. That part doesn't matter too much, but we're going to call it add password to users. So for migrations where you're adding a column, it's always add some general name for the column and then to the table that you're adding to, right? So we're generating that part. That part looks fine. We've got our migration. It just kind of stubbed out the functionality for me. I see that I messed up here because this has an extra O because of how my terminal is showing things to me. So I'm going to fix that first, right? I still have access to the change method. I'm just going to use a different macro, right? If you go into the active record documentation, there's a bunch of different macros that we can use with the change method. The most common one we use is called create table, but that's not what we're doing here. We're adding a column. So we're going to use that macro. So this is called add column. And then, so the way that this works, and again, it's in the documentation, it's always the name of the table you're adding to. So that's our user table, the name of the column that you're adding. So that's called password digest. And then the data type you want stored in that column. So that's going to be a string, right? Any questions about that bit? Cool. So we're going to go ahead and migrate. db migrate. Cool. That looks like it did the thing, but we're going to confirm. If we look at our schema, it looks like that's updated, right? So now I have the ability to store a hash password. So that I've got. What I'm going to do right now is kind of a hacky thing because I'm choosing to do login before I'm using sign up. All of my stubbed in users, the ones for my seed data, they don't have passwords. They have names and they have emails. So I can't log in with that data because I'm using has secure password, right? It won't let me log in using that information. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop into a rake console, and you could do it this way in your app. You could implement sign up first. It doesn't matter too much, but sign up is taught pretty clearly in the lessons. So I just wanted to target other things first. So we're going to go into a console, and I'm just going to make a new user who fits the requirements. So I'm going to make a new user. Okay. That user has a name. That user has an email. I don't have any validations on my email. So like in theory, this is not a real life email, but it's going to work for our purposes. I'm going to call it Dominique. Dominique.com, and that should work here. And then my password is going to be Dominique. Now, obviously, this is a silly. Oh, it's not D, it's you. Obviously, this is a silly example, but you're going to find when you start working on your projects that it becomes a bit tedious to kind of be subbing out some of this data as you're testing out your forms, as you're making new users. So it's helpful to have a methodology for how you're generating this stuff. So I'm just doing name, and then the email is name@name.com, and the password is name. Something that's easy to remember, so I don't have to use any bandwidth on that piece. I'm going to go ahead and save that user. That returns true. So my has secure password is happy with that. And now if I look at all of my users, I get kind of the weird ones that I generated from my C data. But then the very last one has a password digest. The other ones don't, because I created them before that attribute existed, right? So I'm only creating this one right now so that I'm able to log in right now, right? Questions about that piece? Cool. We talked about having a methodology, so that we're good. We can get out of this right now. Cool. So I've got a new user who has a password. What do I want to do next? I want to start building out my views for sign up and for logging in and out. So I think I don't have most of this already. So I've only got, I've got a users folder, but nothing is in it. Everything has been related to posts so far. I'm going to still need this users folder. I'm also going to need a folder for my sessions related stuff. What is the difference between users stuff, like a users controller and users views, versus session stuff, session controllers and session views? Anybody know sessions versus users?
Would that be after logged in?
Well, anything that's related to log in and log out should be in sessions. Users is related to making users, and other things assorted with like RESTful user related actions. So all we're going to build in this app is like making a new user, but in theory, you could have functionality that lets you display all of your users if you wanted to. You could have something like a profile page where you showed a bunch of stuff about a specific user, right? That's something that you could do in users. We're just not going to focus on that here. But the main takeaway is anything related to log in and log out is related to sessions, and users is what's going to handle the actual sign up and making a new user, right? So that's the main difference. Any questions on that? Like, I know as a student, I found that a little confusing.
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
So anything in sessions, so in your sessions views, or we're going to get to making our controllers, like sessions is related to log in and log out. User stuff for right now is just going to be related to sign up, but in theory, it's anything related to keeping track of user objects, not whether they're logged in or not. Cool. So now we're going to start handling login. So that's related to sessions. So in my sessions folder, I'm going to add a file called login.erb. It's also fairly common to use something like sign in, but I think that's really easy to confuse with sign up. So I tend to use log in, log out terminology. They're both fairly common. So I'm going to call that view log in. And then where do I start? So I've got these two folders. I don't have controllers to handle these. So I'm going to need a separate users controller, which is responsible for making users and handling routing related to users. So that's my users controller, and I'm going to make a sessions controller whose job is to handle log in and log out. Sessions controller.rb. Cool. And then starting off a controller looks pretty much the same way every single time. So we're going to do class users controller. And then what do we inherit from?
Active record?
Application controller.
Right, from your main controller. Otherwise, you're not going to get the goodness that we've defined in here. We have to inherit from this controller. So we're going to inherit from application controller. And we're going to copy paste over to sessions and just update the name. What else do I need if I'm adding controllers? How do I let my application know to run these controllers?
You need to put it in config RU.
Yeah, you've got to mount your controllers. So, right, I've already run my application controller. I've already used my post controller. I need to use any other controllers in my application. So I'm going to go ahead and add sessions, but I'm going to spell it right. And I'm going to add users, right? That's just as far as like getting the controllers to register, right? Any questions about that bit? Cool. So we're good. I've got that piece here. Now, as far as actually implementing login and log out, as far as your routing, it's mostly simple. So I'm in my sessions controller because I'm handling login and log out. I'm going to call this get login. Again, it could be something like sign in. I just find that confusing, but both are fairly conventional. We're going to call this get login, and all it's going to do is render that login view that ultimately is going to contain a form that lets a user log in. So we do that with the ERB keyword. We have to remember that it's nested. So we're going to go into that sessions folder, which is where we have that view, and we're going to render login. Okay. That part is easy. We're just rendering that form. Now, anytime we're working with a form, we need a route to handle its submission. Right. Anyone know what kind of requests we should be making here? Post? Yeah.
Post.
Yeah, it should be post, unless you're editing or deleting, right? So we're going to make a post also to login, right? And again, this is mostly just convention. There's nothing too special about these names. Sessions is a little different in that it's not the kind of traditional RESTful routes, but again, calling it something like login or sign in is fairly conventional, right? Now, as I generally do, I'm going to add a binding in here right off the bat. So when I actually build that form and I submit it, I can confirm that it goes somewhere. As far as the actual login, maybe I start with something to orient my user, something like log into your account. You guys proofread me because on HTML, I find the way to make the most mistakes. But we're going to add a form here. We're going to close our form. We have to tell it what kind of request to make and where to go. So our method is going to be post here, and our action is going to be login, right? I think that part should be fairly straightforward. The form itself is not actually hard. It's fairly typical. We're going to have a couple of inputs. I'm just going to orient my user with a label. So I'm going to give them a user for, I think here, I just want them to do their email and their password for login. So this will be for their email. I always forget if this is self-closing or not. It is not. So just a label so they know what they're filling out. And then a simple input. This type is text, right? And then as far as structuring my params hash, I'm going to need to use the name attribute, and this is going to be for their email, right? So that part is fairly typical. Maybe I add in some spacing so it looks nice. I can copy paste this right over. And then this will be for the password, but I'm going to make a small adjustment. Password, this will be for password. And then, so one thing when you're working with forms, when you're handling the password, one thing that you generally see implemented when you're typing in a password is either that you can't see it or it's got those dots that come up. The way you can get the dots to come up in your form is to change this type here to password, right? That's what handles that implementation, right? And then other than that, we just need a simple submit button. So we're going to call that type is submit. Okay. Any questions about that form structure?
And I don't necessarily need to know how, but where would we put validation for, like, say, the email or the password to adhere to certain structure?
So basically there's two, well, I guess it ultimately depends on what kinds of things you're validating. There's two common ways that you're going to handle validations. You can either do that in your models with some macros that come from Active Record. So if you Google Active Record validations, there's a bunch of macros that you can use. You can build your own custom validations. That's something that we'll do in Mod 3. But there are some that already come out of the box. So you can make sure that their email is unique. You can make sure their email is present. You can make sure it's a certain number of characters long. You have some options there. That's probably the higher level way of doing it. Another way that you could do it that's controller side, and they teach it in some labs like the Flitter lab, is when you're handling form submission. So here we could have some kind of logic like if param's email is not empty and if param's email is, I don't know, greater than equal to this many characters. So you can have just kind of if statements that are going to params directly and asking whatever question you're trying to validate, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah, so those are the two most common use cases. You kind of get extra bonus points if you use active record validations because it's the pattern that we're going to move toward in mod 3. Okay, so we have that form we're getting here. Now, if I go over to my app, which is hanging out here, it's still, I think I must have, I got a couple running. That's what it is. So if we're going back here, what am I trying to do? I'm trying to go to login. Right? So if I navigate to that route, which I'm just calling get login, right? I'm probably in a pry here. Try again. So now we're in this pry action here. We want to get out of here. Okay, so now that's not right. We're rendering our form sessions, login. We're going into our sessions. I saved everything. Let's log in my ERB. That doesn't make any sense at all.
Go back there, like semicolon missing.
Semicolon is.
Yeah.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. I know. Thank you.
ERB.
Gotcha. Thank you, Sergey. Okay, cool. So then that's helpful. And yes, you're right, John, for active record validations, they only get run, we talked about this in our last study group, when you're calling a method that ultimately is going to run some SQL. So for update, for save, for create, that's when the actual validations get run. And if they don't pass, you don't actually run those SQL statements. Okay, for logging in, so I'm going to use that user that I just generated in console. I've used that user today, so it's already auto-populating. And I think I just had that password as my name. Right, so now I'm hanging in pry. So I'm, oh no. So I'm here, right? So I can look at my params and I see, that's not right. Oh, because I call, this is the hazard of copy pasting. I called everything email, which I don't want to do. This I want to call password, right? Another benefit of like immediately when your form is submitting, make sure you're getting here and that everything looks okay. Right, so now if I try again, right, I'm hanging because I'm in pry. If I look at params, and I've got everything here. So I've got my email, I've got my password. I only have access to the unsalted, unhashed version in this moment, but I'm not storing it in an insecure way. Now, once I have that data, what do I ultimately want to do in my post login, right? So what do I want to do, right? I've got this user that already exists in my database, right? I have their data in my params. What's my next step?
You want to process the params.
Tell me more.
So you would find by, assuming that the user's already in, and if the user isn't in, you want to redirect them to the sign up page or wherever you're trying to redirect them.
So I want to find that user because if they're logging in, they're a user that should exist in my database. So I'm going to find them based on something that's unique. Probably not going to find them on password. It's usually going to be something like an email or a username, right? So I'm going to go ahead and find that user first. And if I can initiate the process of logging them in. So I'm going to go ahead and do a user is user.find by, and I'm going to use email. I don't know how that happened. Okay, so I'm going to find the user, right? And then I can say, hey, if that returns a valid user, right? Because if I don't find them, this is going to return nil. How do I actually go about authenticating the password they entered? I gave you a hint in how I phrase this. How do I check their login credentials versus what I have in the database? Any of you who've seen this? What's a handy dandy method that I get access to just by virtue of adding this macro here?
Is it authentication?
Yeah, it's authenticate. So when you use, thanks Shamal, when you use has secure password, one of the methods that you get access to is, I think this is in here somewhere. Sometimes this documentation is like reading gibberish. It's like not written for the average person. But there's an authenticate method that you can use. So essentially what we can do, right, is we're going to say for that user, we're going to authenticate their password. So we call it on the user model because that's what gets has secure password. But then we're going to pass it whatever was entered in for their password in the login form. So we're going to access that via params password, right? And essentially what happens there is two things, right? This authenticate method is working with bcrypt. It's going to take this entered password. It's going to salt it and use its hashing algorithm to give a jumbled up version, right? That's going to follow a certain set of rules that in theory, if it's the right password, should match the salted version stored in our database. So it's going to do the salting and the jumbling it up, and it's going to compare the jumbled up version that's stored in our password digest column for that user, and it's going to see if they're the same, right? And if they are, this should return true. Right? So that's essentially what that's doing. It's confirming that those two passwords are the same, but it will first scramble up this one and then see if it matches the other scrambled up one. And that's kind of how that's working in a nutshell. So once I found that user and I've confirmed that they entered the right password, well, this is actually the easy part after explaining that bit. One very typical question you might get asked in your assessment is what is the line that logs in your user, right? How do I physically log in a user once I've got sessions enabled? What's that pattern look like? Well, we know we keep track of the user in the session hash, right? So that's just a hash. As far as how we implement this, the way it's typically done is you're going to add a key into that sessions hash whose value is the ID of the current user, because that's the unique identifier on your user, right? So there's nothing special about what we're going to call this key that we make. It's most commonly either like ID or something like user ID, or you could be super brief and call it UID. It doesn't matter. There's nothing special about the name in that it should be descriptive like all your variables should be. I'm going to choose to call it user ID, right? So all this is going to do is it's going to set a key in that hash, but the important part is that I give it a value of the current user's ID, right? Because I have access to the current user, assuming I found them, right? I found them and their password checked out. So all I'm going to do is say in this hash, go ahead and set that value to the user's ID, right? I'm actually going to mimic this in Pry since we're here, right? So I'm going to ask the question, does the user exist and do they authenticate? Does their password match? Where does super come from? Undefined local, oh, because I don't have this line. There we go. You have to be careful in Pry. So I got to find the user first. So now there's a user variable that's been defined. And then I can ask the question, do they exist and does their password check out? It returns the user object, but those are both truthy, so that should return true. I think it's just returning this last value. But in the context of this statement, they're both truthy. So now we're just going to do the following, right? Sessions is just a hash. So we're just going to add a key value pair to it, right? It's going to return the value of what I set because that's just what happens when you assign a value to a hash. But if I look at the session, I got all this other wacky stuff that was in there, but now I've got a key called user ID that points to the value of that user's ID, right? It's a simple concept, but they may literally ask you, point to the line in your controller that logs in your user, and that's all it is. It's the act of adding that key value pair into that hash. Very typical question. So that's how we log in the user, but that's assuming everything checked out. So first off, if we do that, we should take them somewhere. Otherwise, we just don't get an error, but nothing happens. So you could do like a home page where you take a user to right away. I'm just going to redirect them to posts because that makes sense in the context of this application. So I'm going to redirect to posts because remember we redirect to a route and we render a view. But if something doesn't check out right, like if I don't find the user or their password's not right, you want to do something. You want to give them feedback. For right now, I'm just going to take them back to the login form. But in theory, you could do something like render a flash message or render an error message like, hey, dummy, try again. Like your password's not right. Please try again. But for right now, we're just going to handle the redirect. Redirect to login, right? So if everything checked out, log them in, take them to their post page. Otherwise, take them back to the login form because something went wrong. Right. Any questions about that piece?
For line 10, so if they ever ask us what's that line mean, we just say that just logs in your user by accessing the hash.
We are not accessing, we are updating, right? Accessing would be like if we did session user ID, that would give us the value, but we're setting a value, right? So we're assigning a key and a value into that existing hash, right? So that part, I mean, it's not hard. It's hard relative to what I'm going to do next. The easy part is logging out, right? Because session is just a hash, and we have a nice, easy method that lets us dump out whatever is in a hash. So if I want to handle logout, I first need a route to do that. We're going to define it as a get route. But we're ultimately going to trigger it. See, I didn't actually build that yet. We might do that as a bonus. I didn't build that for today because in theory, you'd have something like a button that you click it and it logs you out, right? But I didn't plan for that today. For right now, it's going to be something they have to do in the URL, right? But we're going to make a get request to the login route, right? So that's what we have to type in the browser. But then as far as how we actually do that, right? What's a method we can use to dump out what's in the session hash? Anyone who's seen this so far? I feel like you guys have seen that so far in the lessons if you're on pace. But there's a method called clear that will clear out that hash. It's probably not the only way to dump out what's in a hash, but it's the one that is conventional given what we're trying to do as far as handling the sessions. So all we're going to do.
The route's called login.
Ah, you're right. That probably makes more sense. We can't have two get logins. We want to log out. I can't talk and chew gum at the same time. I make mistakes. But yes, we want to call this logout, right? But then as far as actually dumping the hash, what we're going to do is we're going to clear it, right? We're just going to use, and actually I'll show you this. This might be a little funky when I go back into the browser, but that's okay. So if I clear it, I just end up with an empty hash. Everything out of there, it's gone, right? So that's how we would log out a user, right? In the browser, that's enough to do that, but then they kind of just get a blank page, which is kind of disconcerting no matter what you're doing in an application. You want some meaningful feedback. So I'm going to choose in this case to just redirect them to the login form, right? When you log out, it kind of makes sense that you're going to get taken back either to like a login form or a sign up form, something of that nature, right? So that just makes sense given our application, right? So we clear the session and then we log them, or we redirect them to their login. Let me show you guys that in the browser real fast. It might be funky because I've been poking around in Pry with this. Let me get that Pry out of here. I think I did. I am going to exit this Pry session. I'm pretty sure I'm logged out right now because it took me directly here. If I go to posts, there's a Pry somewhere. I'll have to take that out eventually. But if I go to log in again, I'm still here. Okay, it takes me to my login form. I can go ahead and log in again because I logged myself out inadvertently. Okay, so I'm just putting in my same credentials. I can submit and then log in. I'm back in this Pry here because I told it once you log me in, take me back to my post page. That's what I told it to do here. So it's doing the right thing and made it this far, right? Now I'm just going to exit so that I then get there, right? So it's taking me back to all of my posts, right? But then as far as actually logging out, well, what's my rule? My rule is that I need to make a GET request to the logout path or URL. So I could do that with just log out, right? And it just took me back to the form, but I am logged out right now, right? So some of this is subjective, like what do you want your app to do in certain cases, but there are patterns involved, like what's most common, right? Any questions about the log in and log out? Cool. So I'm gonna go into some helpers that I want to build. I was hoping to get much further than this by this point, but I'm doing my best. One thing that you guys really have to pay attention to in your projects is that not any user should be allowed to do anything in your application. When you look at the project requirements, you need to make sure that certain things can only be done when a user is logged in, right? Now, if you're building your own app, you kind of have some leeway on this where like maybe if you're not logged in, I let you do certain things, but then like logged in users get to do all these other things. But the expectation for this project is that if you're logged in, you should be able to create, read, update, and destroy whatever thing the user has. So the expectation is that you're making sure the user is logged in for them to see any of those views. That's required. Another thing that you'll have to implement is that a user can only edit and delete their own stuff. Right? So those are two things that they're looking for. They're not inherently hard. It's just kind of like some of them you wouldn't know unless you had seen it. So what we're going to start out with first is some helpers that we're going to use in our controllers so that we don't have to repeat ourselves a bunch and we have some logic to help us out. There are a couple of ways that you guys get taught to do this in the lessons. In one way, you're sort of doing it directly in your application controller, and in another way, you're using a separate helper file. The strong preference from the team is that you do it in your application controller and not use a separate helper module. So that's the way I'm going to do it here, the preferred way. So essentially what you can do is you can define this helpers block, right? You're literally defining helper methods here that because your other controllers, they inherit from this application controller, they're going to have access to those methods in any of those controller actions. So I'm defining some helper methods here, and there are two really common ones that, again, they can be implemented other ways, but I'm showing you the common pattern, so you're aware of that pattern. The first convention is to use a method called logged in, where you're asking like, hey, is this current user logged in right now? Right? Anyone remember what's special about methods that end in a question mark?
They're Booleans.
Well, they return Boolean values because it's like you're asking a question. Is this thing? And then if it is, you get true. If not, you get false, right? So this is a common pattern. Now, thinking of what we implemented before, how do we know if a user is logged in? What is our mechanism for keeping track of that?
The sessions.
The session hash.
User ID.
Yes. So we need to be able to say, hey, if I go in the session ID, or sorry, in the session hash, and I try to access this key of user ID, is it there? Right? Now that itself is going to return one of two things, right? If it's in there, it's going to return the ID, the integer, right? So right now that's 4 for my user. But if it's not in there, what should this return? If you try to access a key that's not in a hash, what do you get back?
Nil.
Nil. Good. Is nil truthy or falsy?
Falsy.
Falsy. Is an integer truthy or falsy?
Truthy.
Truthy, right? In Ruby, nil and false are falsy, and every single other thing is truthy, right? So this is why we stress Boolean values in mod 1 for one of many reasons. Now, this is going to return either a thing or a nil. What we're going to do that's a common pattern is we're going to coerce those values into their like their truthiness measure, right? using what we call the double bang operator. You guys remember this from mod 1? Right. Essentially what it does is it's going to, if this is truthy, it's going to return true. And if this is a falsy thing, it's going to return false, right? So it's coercing it so that it's going to return either a true or a false. Whereas we've all seen the single bang, which flips the logic. It's saying not that thing. But here we use the double bang to actually return the truthiness value. So we always get back a true or false, right? And again, you could build it however you want. You could say something like if session user ID equals nil, return false, else return true. There's more verbose ways to build this. This is just a really common pattern, right? Any questions on that piece? Okay, so that piece is pretty typical. We're gonna build one more, right? It's very common to build a method that then just keeps track of your current user. Who is it right now? Like who is the current person that's logged in? So typically we would call this current user. You could call it my super cool logged in user. It's just not conventional. We call it current user. And what it's going to do is actually a couple of things. It's going to find that current user and return it, but we're going to use a technique called memoization that's going to keep us from having to do that more often than we have to. And I'll share some, I think we have, they mention it in I think like it's like the school domain lab that you guys did in mod 1 with the or equals. You might have remembered seeing a link for that. I'll share some links related to that, basics of memoization, and there's something related to the or equals. But essentially what we're gonna say is this. We want to find the current user based on what we have in this session. We have the current ID in the session hash. So we're going to go into our model and we're going to try to find that user. So we're going to use find by ID here. We could also use find by. And we're going to say, try to find the user by that user ID, right? Now, the issue is that we don't need to do that every single time we call this method, right? If we're using this method in 10 different controller actions, we're actually building a really inefficient program because we might have thousands of users. We don't need to ping our user database any more than necessary. So the actual memoization part looks like this. We're going to say if there is a value for @user, right? It's an instance variable because I want to use it across controllers. So if user exists, return it. Otherwise, we're going to use this special or equals operator and set user to the value of this method call, right? So when this is kind of a complicated topic because it's not actually this simple, but this is sort of like saying user or user equals user.findby. Right? Because when we're working with or operators, it's read left to right until something is truthy, and then it stops. It returns that thing. So if I said truthy thing or falsy thing, it's going to return the truthy thing and never get to the falsy. But if it says falsy thing or truthy thing, falsy thing doesn't work. It's going to check the truthy thing and return it. Right? So this is using a similar pattern. It's saying, hey, if I've ever found this user before, just return its value, and that will be truthy, so we never get here. But the very first time we have this user that's logged in, this will be nil, which is falsy. So we're going to say, hey, go ahead and ping my database and find this user by their ID. And we can maybe even say something like assuming that they're logged in, right? Because we can make this check first, right? That's a bit of a complicated idea. They do talk through it a bit in the lessons, and I'll share some resources on memoization. But it's basically keeping us from doing this every single time this method is called. We really only need to do it the one time for the current user. Okay. Any questions about that piece?
And what's the goal of memoization? Like, why did we use it?
The goal is for efficiency in our program so that we're not making more database calls than we need to.
Okay.
Right? So it's similar to caching or saving a piece of data. right? So like once we have it, like we can just use that and not keep finding it over and over again when we don't need to, essentially is what that's doing.
But when is the current user reset?
When is the current user reset?
I can imagine that in between sessions, the user changes.
Mm-hmm. When is the current user reset? When user changes. Well, user. Let me think on that. For right now, do you have any helpful hints for me? Is there something I'm missing here?
No, that's also a question that I have.
Gotcha.
So,
Gotcha.
because I can imagine that add user once somebody logs in and hits this helper method, it will stay add user.
Gotcha. Because it's like it's caching the lost user. Let me think on that. I'm not 100% sure. We do have this piece. We're caching it. We have these helpers. I'm going to at least show you guys some basic protection for your routes. I know it's 7:30. I don't want to peer pressure you into staying if you have other things to do. You're welcome to hang out because I'm going to keep going even if I'm like talking to myself. The show must go on. And it's actually not too bad. We've got most of the hard stuff out of the way. The only thing that's a little tricky from here is URL hacking, but that's more fun than anything. So what we're going to do is...
Do helper methods, do the helpers, do they constantly run? Is that just always there?
Well, they're defined here, and then you can call them as needed in your controllers. So because we've defined these in this block, we have access to these methods inside of any of our other controller actions, right? So there's scope to that. That's kind of like, I mean, it's not the only reason, but it's kind of like the main reason I stress that your other controllers should inherit from this controller, not from Sinatra base, because they need to get anything this controller also knows about, like the session secret, or the sessions in general, and your helpers, right? So what we're gonna do here is a couple of things. And again, they are gonna check your project for this. You need to make sure that a logged in user can do certain things, and if they're not logged in, they can't do those things. That's kind of the main thing. So what I'm gonna do, right, is I'm basically going to implement this in a bunch of my routes. It's not hard, and you're gonna see the pattern pretty like early on, right? What I'm gonna basically say is, hey, this stuff here, right, only do that if the user is logged in, if I've confirmed that. So I can say, hey, if the user is logged in, then get all the posts and render that view, right? Otherwise, and we're gonna do this virtually every time, if they're not logged in, you're gonna take them right over to the login form and have them log in, redirect to login, right? So that's gonna be a pattern that we implement in most of these routes. Are you logged in? If so, you can see this stuff. Otherwise, nope, go back to the login form, right? What I'm also gonna change here, I'm gonna change a couple things actually. So does a logged in user likely want to see everybody's posts, period? Do they want to see all the posts for every single user?
No.
Probably not in most simple use cases. There could be thousands of posts in this application. A user is generally going to be concerned with their stuff, right? We start with this pattern first before we start leveraging our object relationships. But how can we get the actual posts from our current user? How do we make use of our, one, our helper method, and two, our object association methods that are built from these macros, right? We've got this user who has many posts and a post that belongs to a user. Right now we're not doing much at all with those active record methods that are built for us. How do we adjust this line here? First off, how do we access the current user right now? I'm giving it away.
It's already, that's what the helper method's for, right?
Right, we have to call the helper method, right? It's called current user, and the way I've set it up is that it will return the current user, assuming that they're logged in. So it's gonna return a user object. So I can now use that piece. So I can say, instead of getting everybody's posts, go ahead and grab the current user, and how do I get their posts?
Is that all?
Well, .all is not something a user knows about. It's something that the model knows about. So when we use a has many, right? When we use that macros, I tried to make a big thing about this. If record has many, this is why I try to stress this so that you can remember when you're working in your projects to use these methods. When we use a has many, we get 17 methods built for us. The first one is called collection, which is the thing that you have many of. So a user has many posts, so we get a method called .posts for our user. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say current user .posts. So we're being more efficient because we're not going through everybody's posts. We're going through the user's posts, only their stuff. So it's more efficient and it's more secure because we don't even want to give the current user access to anybody else's stuff. So we're going to go through their posts, and I probably shouldn't have deleted all of that, but it's going to be the same idea. We're going to do posts find by, oh, actually we want all of them. We just want all their posts. I'm getting my methods mixed up. We're getting all of their posts, and then we're going to render the show, and then we're going to take them back to login, right? As far as new, if you guys weren't here in the last study group, I did kind of a hacky thing so that when I submitted my users my post form to make a new post, let me show you. So what I really wanted was when this form was submitted to associate it with a user, but I didn't have that functionality because I didn't have any real users and like a way to connect them. So what I implemented that I'm going to get rid of right now is basically a select, like a drop down. My English is failing me, right? But we implemented this drop down that it literally would list all of the users. And then when you went to make a post, you picked which user you were so that when you submitted the form, you had the user and the post, right? Which is super tedious and weird to a user and would let them pick like random users and associate posts with them. So we're going to get rid of that for right now, right? Because now we have a means of keeping track of the current user. We don't have to have the user pick themselves from a drop-down form. So we're going to get rid of that in our actual form. And we're also going to get rid of this call, which we only had so that the drop down would render, right? That was only to get that piece to work. Now, this part is actually easy. All we want to do is make sure that we only see that form if we're logged in. So that's going to follow pretty much the same pattern here. If they're logged in, do the thing, otherwise redirect them. So this is where it's going to get a little repetitive. So if they're logged in, let them see the form, right? They can make new stuff. Otherwise, nope, just kidding. You have to go back to the login form. So I'm making them go back to that route if they're not logged in.
There's
right?
no shorthand way of doing that instead of constantly doing if else.
There is a shorthand way that I will probably show you guys on Thursday, or I would be happy to repeat it in later study groups. You basically have something called a before action that you can use. I think this doesn't get taught until mod 3, but there is a way of specifying, hey, run this command for specific controller actions before you do anything else. I'm doing it this longhand way first because you guys haven't been taught another way. So we're going to refactor it away essentially. Because it is going to get repetitive, but I'm also stressing the point so you guys get that you have to do this every single time. For now anyway, right? So that's for my new. We're going to do the same thing for handling form submission, right? Let me make sure I'm not missing anything here. I think this form is actually easy. It's the patch form that gets tricky. So we have that part here. Now, so same idea here. If they're logged in, go ahead and find that user and the post. Actually, this part we're going to change in a second. But if we're logged in, we do that stuff. Otherwise, if we're not logged in, we take them back to that route, right? We redirect to a route, we render a view, right? So we're getting a sense of the pattern here. Now, I can adjust this line right here. I guess I could condense this into one line. It doesn't matter too much, but the takeaway is that I don't have to ping my user model for the current user because I've got a helper that will help me out with that. So we're going to refactor this. We could do something like this if we wanted to do it just like in 2 lines and not change the structure. We could say user is current user, right? And then this line, I think, doesn't actually have to change at all because now we're getting the posts from that user, right? We could also condense it into, oh no, we could also condense it into one line if we wanted, right? And just do current user dot posts, right? So one thing that they'll look for in your projects, and if they don't see it, they might have you do it as a live refactor, is they're interested in you using methods like a build or like a create, right? Some of those higher level active record association methods. It's not that it's the only right way of doing it. It would totally be okay to do something like, what else could you do here? I guess you could do like a current user dot post and then shovel the new post, and then you could like set the user ID on the post. You could do it in multiple steps like that in some of the lower level methods, but they might then ask you like, hey, what's another way that we could do this? This is just a nice condensed way of doing it in one line because we remember that build does what? I think it does 3 things. What does build do for us? I heard a whimper. What does
It
build?
saves.
It does
Saves
not
to the
save.
database.
That's one thing it doesn't do. Create does that. Right. So build is going to do a couple things. It's going to create the new thing, which right now is a post. So it's going to make a new post. It's going to associate that post with the user. So it's going to give that post a user ID of the current user. And it's also, because we're calling it directly on the collections, it's going to add that new post into the current user's posts. So it's doing all those 3 things in one line, right? So we do that first, and then we can say, hey, if that post saves, take us to posts. I remember you asked this question a while back, why don't we just save things right away? Because sometimes we want to build associations or perform validations or some kind of thing, and then save and make sure everything is good. So we're associating these 2, and then we can go about saving and redirecting, right? Any questions about that piece?
Can you repeat why was it important to use the build method here?
One, because it shows that you have an understanding of active record association methods. So it's going to look nice because you're handling a lot of functionality in one step. You're leveraging your model associations, and you're using a higher order method that's making a new instance and handling both sides of the association in one go. Right? It's not the only right way to do it, but it's a way that is going to look nice, and it's like, it's considered nicer looking if you build it out that way. Cool.
And it's here, and what it's doing, it's creating the object.
It's creating the new object, which is a post, right?
Okay.
And it's associating it with the user on both ends. So the post knows about the user knows it just got that new post. It just doesn't save. We're going to handle that on the next piece, right? This is also important because you might have validations on your post model. So I think I actually put in a couple in our last study group in our actual model, right? So I only had something simple, which is like a title and a body has to be there for a post, right? So because I have validations, that's going to be checked before that actual post is saved to my database, which is another good reason that we do like an if a dot save. So now I have that piece here. That looks good. I'm going to try to save some of the demoing towards the end. I'll like just show that everything works nice because I want to get through the actual logic. We're also going to do something similar for our edit, but kind of with a twist. So with show, it's easy. We're going to do that first. It's going to be the same thing. If the user is logged in, go ahead and do all this stuff. Otherwise, take them to login. Direct. And there are ways to clean this up too. I don't really love these nested if else's, but it's nice because it gives you a lot of control as far as how we're handling the redirect in the various cases. We're going to take them to login here. I don't think anything else. Oh, one thing here needs to change. Same idea as what we did before. We're just going to leverage our model associations. So instead of going through all the posts, we're going to go through the current user's posts. So we're not going to ping our database because we could have thousands of posts. We're going to say, hey, give me the current user let me access their posts and then try to find this ID among their current posts. This is also more secure because it's going to help when we talk about like trying to hack your form. Like it's going to help prevent a user from trying to access somebody else's stuff. Like they can try to access, I think in this case, they can't URL hack it, but they could try to view the form, like inspect it and try to hack it there. And I'll try to show you guys that quickly if we have time today. If not today, in a office hours. So if they're logged in, do this. So we're making use of the current user's posts. We're gonna do something similar. Oh yeah, this isn't for edit. Okay, that's fine. Still the same pattern. If logged in, do the same thing. Else, redirect to. So you're getting the theme here, if nothing else. You know, for every single thing, you need to see if your user is logged in, except for sign up, right? You don't have to check that if you're signing the user up for the first time. We're going to also adjust here, right? We're seeing the theme. Instead of going through all of the posts, we're going to go through all of the current user's posts, right? So we have that piece. That part we have, that's okay for right now for the edit. Okay. If they're logged in, do this and then render and posts. I think, did I change this here? I thought I implemented more logic in this last time. I'm just gonna fix something. Redirect login. What are we saying? If they're logged in, try to find their posts. And we said go through the current user. Posts. I maybe just wasn't good about implementing this the last time. We want to say something like if we get that post, then render this, because we might conceivably not find whichever one they're trying to access, and we want to handle that. So that's where we're getting kind of into this ugly nested territory. But we want to say something like, hey, if they found that post, take them to the edit form. Because if you don't do that, if you get a nil post, this is going to break. So we're also just going to handle that case. If you don't get that post back, maybe just do something innocuous. Take them somewhere. Take them to their show page, for example. So you can do a redirect to posts, something like that. Right. I know I'm going kind of fast. Are there questions so far? Are you guys hanging in there okay?
So you said to take them back to the show page. Why was it important to put that logic in?
Well, you don't want this view to break on them, but you want something else to happen so that the user has a sense of what's going on. So in a perfect world, you might redirect them and then render an error message. We just haven't talked about how to do that yet. So we're just handling the redirect.
Oh, is this like a safety net? Or like?
Yeah, it's you whatever happens in your application, you don't want it to fail in an unclear or ugly way on the user. You want it to fail gracefully.
Okay.
Right. So right now, just kind of the easiest way of doing that is we're going to redirect.
Yeah.
So we have that piece now. I'm going to show you the basic part for this, for the patch. So I'm going to show you the starter way for doing this. It's going to follow the same exact pattern, right? If we're logged in, go ahead and do all this other stuff. Otherwise, correct login, right? Now, we also want to update this piece here. So we're not going through all the posts. We're going through the current user's posts. User.posts.findby. Now, this works. This is fine. If I try to hack my application, this will break. So I might come back to the end and fix something here because I do want to show you what I mean by like a user trying to hack your application to try to see stuff or edit stuff they're not supposed to. But for right now, this is good enough for our purposes. And then for the delete, it's easy. It's just if logged in, kind of that same pattern we're seeing. In, do all this stuff. So we're getting this theme at least as far as checking to see if the user is logged in. Redirect login. And we will talk about how to refactor this because some of this code bothers me on a deep level. But it's getting the concept across, right? Is there any questions so far as this check? Always checking to see if they're logged in. They can't do anything else unless that's the case.
So it's saying like if this is true, then the next line.
Right. So if it's true that they're logged in, so like a logged in, like a user that's not logged in, why are they deleting stuff in the first place? That's not something that you can ever allow, but it's not something that your application by default is going to protect against. Like you have to build that, right? So that's what we have here. I think we mostly, so now we're protected here. I've handled the delete. There's just one little thing I want to fix as far as guarding this. We're probably not going to get to user sign up today. We're not going to be here indefinitely. That's something I can do quickly on Thursday. The last thing I want to show you. So like there's a few different ways to implement this logic of making sure a user can only delete and edit their own stuff. I'm going to show you a way that's kind of in line with what we're building here, but kind of a takeaway is that when your assessor looks at your code, they're going to want to check for a few things. And one of them is if you're protecting, well, one, this logged in stuff that we're talking about. Most students get that part right. A lot of students don't think about protecting. I think the biggest one is that they either don't protect their edit and their patch, or they get their edit, but they don't protect their patch. So if we're looking at your app and how it's running, essentially the user is going, like not the user, the assessor. Let me go ahead and log in real fast so that makes more sense. Because we've got a lot of functionality we haven't actually tested.
Yeah, how can the assessor try to stump us here?
Well, so right now I don't have any posts as this current user. This is probably a nice time to check that I can make new things. Some post. Right. So I can make a new post currently because I'm a logged in user, right? It's taking me to my post. So one way that's fairly simple, this isn't going to work because we've built the logic for it. I made a post with the ID of 12. I should not be able to do something like, well, first off, I shouldn't be able to view anybody else's posts. I don't think, let's see. Yeah, it takes me right back to mine. So I can't even view other people's posts, but I certainly can't do something like posts one edit. I can't try to manipulate in the browser, trying to view that edit form for somebody else's posts. I know I did not make the post with the ID of 1. That was the very first one I made. This user didn't exist yet. So I shouldn't be able to go ahead and do that here. It doesn't work in my application because I built it that way. I've said, hey, I only need to get to this, like once I get here, first I check if they're logged in, but then I'm only ever working off of the current user, the one that's logged in right now, right? So I'm never like able to get the post with that ID because it's not among their posts, right? That's one way of doing this. A more rudimentary way of doing this, which is how I did it as a student, is you could say something like, if the user ID on this current post right now is the same as the ID of this user, then let them do it. That has the same functionality. It's just considered lower level because you're comparing literal IDs. So you could say something like, if this current post belongs to this user right now. That's another way that we could do this, right? If you want, I can show you my old ugly project and maybe like in office hours. But this is a nicer way of implementing it because we're only ever working off of the current user. So we're never opening it up to posts about other users. That's one way of doing it. Another way that's super, super common, let's say I do want to edit one of my posts. I can do that by clicking the button because I built that. I can view the edit form for that post, but then if I'm up to no good, I can inspect my HTML, if I'm a bad actor, I can find my form somewhere in here, right? I can find my form here, and I can actually edit this code right here, right? I'm pretty sure when I do this, this is going to break. It's going to be really easy for us to fix that, but it's still going to prevent me from editing some other post. I could literally, if I were a bad actor, I actually want to edit post 1 here, which is not my post, right? When I do this right now, I'm like 98% sure I'm just going to get a big old error, but I'll explain why that is. So I've hit enter. I've edited that. So I'm editing the patch request that I'm making. I'm trying to make a patch request to /post1, which is not my post, right? If I hit submit, this is going to break right now, which in some sense is protecting, right? I didn't successfully edit that post. The reason that it's breaking is because of what I'm doing here, because it's not finding that post in that current user's collection, because they don't have a post with the ID of 1. So it's helping, but it's also breaking something. So probably what I would do here, at least as a workaround for right now, I could say something like, if there is a valid post, so if I find that in their collection, then try updating it. Otherwise, they're trying to edit a post that's not theirs. So at the very least, I still got to give them something. I don't want my app to break on the user. Even if it's a bad user, I need to account for that. So I might probably just like re-render the edit form, something like that. Or maybe I take them back to all their posts. In this case, I'm just going to redirect them back to edit and maybe give them a message like, hey, dummy, something went wrong. Try again. What am I trying to take them to? I think it's posts. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to just take them all back to all the posts for ease of use. So that's, I mean, I could take them to the edit form. I'm just being lazy because this is easier to do right now. It depends on what you want to do in your application, but you have to take them somewhere. And let me just show that it's going to accomplish the same thing in that I'm not allowed to edit that post, but it's also not going to break on me. Something will happen and I can then render an error message. So now, let me just refresh because I think I just went back. I could still try to hack this. I could still try to make a post request to that post. And I can hit submit, but now it's just going to redirect me. I think I'm going to, it just took a second, right? So it's still accomplishing the goal of not letting me edit somebody else's post, but it's also not breaking on the user. If I didn't have this logic here, like if I were just going through all the posts, I could literally edit somebody else's posts by editing the form that way. So that's a fairly common thing that they might do in an assessment if they saw that you weren't protecting that route. There are just a couple ways that we can protect the route.
So the way we like protect the route in our own project, we'll do it in the patch request in like our controller.
Yeah. So what many students will do that is in the right spirit is they'll do something like, so I saw this in an assessment I observed the other week. So this student, like she had thought about this, right? She was like, I want to make sure users can only edit their own stuff. And she did something pretty clever where I think she did it on her index page, but it's the same idea. One thing you could do is you can make these buttons only display if that post belongs to that user, right? That's something fairly common, but it doesn't prevent someone from trying to just go in the URL to edit that post anyway, or to hijack your form. So, I mean, you could still implement that here. It's just not enough, right? So my favorite part of my projects is trying to break them or hack them. So that's something I really enjoyed about this project, like seeing what you can do, what you're allowed to do. Can you find the holes? That's just something I enjoy about programming, but it's something you want to keep in the back of your mind. It's not something you'd fail your assessment for. It's something they'd bring up to you and you'd have a conversation, and it'd probably be like a live coding exercise. How do we then protect those routes? It's not a deal breaker on its own. Cool. But it's something that you want to be thinking about.
Okay.
Any last minute questions about protecting those routes?
When you want to give like an error message, do you know how like when you try to log in and it says bad username or bad password, it reverts back to the same login form and then it gives you like a red message of some sort? Is that implemented in the ERB file, or how would that go about?
It is a combination of the controller and the view, I want to say. Again, it's going to be structured a little bit differently, whether you're doing it with like a flash message or if you're using your validations. I think I showed this in the last study group. If you tried like calling a .save or a .update and that doesn't pass, you have access to a few different methods that give you error messages. So I think you can do, so like if you did user.save and that didn't return true, if it returned false, you could then do user.errors and you'd get some information about what didn't pass in your validations. I think you also get a full error messages is another one. That's also in the active record documentation too. I just don't remember it offhand.
Cool.
But it's in the validations.
Are you talking about like when you go on a website and it says like weak password or something?
Yeah,
well, you could do something like that. That's probably going to be a little bit more involved. I want to
I was wondering if that's like a possibility on this. But.
You can. It's not something that I've built into my project, so I'm not sure how to do it offhand. You have a lot going on here as far as validations and the kinds that you can build. Again,
it's also coming back in mod 3.
Yes, it's coming back in mod 3. So in mod 3, you'll have to do it a ton. You'll have to build your own custom ones. With email, it's hard. Like you're probably going to have, like if you want strict validations in your email, you're probably going to use regex in there somewhere. So it's going to require some Googling. It can be done. What was my point? My point was showing you, so there's a way to access your errors. I think you have access to a method called errors, and you also can do errors.details. The point being is there are methods that will give you access to error messages that you could then use to display in the view that you're rendering. That's one way of doing it. Flash messages is another. So those are things. I have like a whole list of things I want to cover in office hours, like whenever I can fit them in, and that is one of the things.
Does next Monday start every day, office hours?
Yes. And we also have on Thursday, we have just kind of a run-of-the-mill office hours that sometimes you guys show up and you're like, I don't have questions, so I will have things. I will have things for us to do. We're gonna stop here. I mean, in a perfect world, I would have done the sign up. That part is not hard, but it's just late, so I'm gonna do that on Thursday. And I'll record that too, even though it's in office hours, because I know there's stuff in there that's gonna be important. Cool. Any last minute questions, concerns, bad jokes? I think maybe a good place to end off is just to show that I did the things I was talking about. So I'm gonna log out real fast. Out. So one thing I want to illustrate is that if I'm logged out, I can't do anything else. I can't see all my posts. Takes me right back here. I can't try to see that post I just made.
Oh.
Takes me right back here. I can't try to edit that post I just made. I think the only thing I can do is I can go back to the home page, which doesn't do anything because I didn't protect that route. I just wasn't concerned with it. But I can't do anything else. I can go to that one, which I guess is fine. It doesn't do anything, but it's got a title. Right?
Can you protect that route? Is the home route not important?
At that point, it's kind of subjective. Your root route can kind of be, I think a typical use, I think the way I did it in my application, I can't speak for every student, but something that would make sense is maybe you greet your user and then you give them a button to sign up, a button to log in, right? So they have those two options, right? Because that's, and if you had like a cutesy little intro as far as what your app does, if it does something more interesting than make blog posts, right? But that's up to you. To a certain point, it's subjective and it's what you want to build. But for all of your CRUD actions, you have to make sure that the user is logged in. And for your editing and deleting, they can only edit and delete their own stuff. That's the takeaway. And now I'm officially done talking. Any last minute?
Yes, my other question was when you were doing the unique like the number, kind of like the API code.
Yeah, the session secret.
Yeah, I missed the part, and just quickly say, where did you get that number from? Is it unique to your project, or?
This number is unique to my project. I used a generator for it. I use this, I want to say that it's a class, like a module. It pre-exists in Ruby. It's not a gem because you don't have to like install it in that way, but it's a library in Ruby that will just generate kind of a string of random numbers and digits. I mean, obviously you'll have this recorded. I'm also going to share you a couple links. And again, this student, Shannon, is pretty great. She kind of talks through how she did this in this project. So I kind of taught it in a way that lines up with what I'm going to actually share as resources. It's not the only right way of doing it.
Got it. So essentially you're saying like we can use the number you had because it's just like a preset of numbers already made?
I mean, so you don't have to use my number. You're going to generate your own number using that command.
Oh, okay. When you generate the command in your local environment, that's...
Yeah, so in this file, well, actually, I guess I didn't do it. I did it in, like I did a one-liner that actually did it for me. I'll share this too. This is kind of a one line that's doing a bunch of things here. But the punchline is it's calling this method in that class that's actually returning that string of characters.
Oh, yeah. You did it in binding.pry, right?
Yeah, I did it two different ways. I did it in the console too.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And that's something we can work on too. It was bothering me more and more that you guys, because people were asking about it, like, how do I do this securely? And the lessons don't tell you how. They're just like, just so you know you can, but we're not really going to give you direction on how to do that. So I just wanted to show you a way. It's not the only way. This, I mean, this is fairly high level, the students who are commenting, but they talk through like a few different ways that this could be done. So if you're someone who's like at a higher level in terms of how you want to think about this, this is probably a good read. If that's not that comfortable, probably this blog post is going to be a good place to start. And then, I mean, we haven't even started project mode yet, so it's not like you have to have it all figured out now. I just wanted to show you a way.
Okay,
cool. Was this helpful?
Yeah.
Or torturous or something?
Very helpful.
There are a few of us still here, so that's something. My second screen just died on me. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. You guys are all set for now?
Yes.
It was nice to see you, John. Thanks for joining us. You were just like volunteered for a long study group, but I appreciate your company.
I passed my review last week, Wednesday, so.
Very nice. And I think you had Lance for your first project too?
Yeah.
That worked out.
And at this moment, I'm already on project mode for my Rails app.
Gotcha. Well,
so
bless you.
Yep.
May the force be with you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
All right. You guys all set for now? Any last minute questions?
Good.
Cool. All right. You guys have a long night. Thanks for hanging out with me.
Thank you.
All right. You're welcome. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.